for all intents and purposes, it was the alignment of Saturn and Jupiter. And this idea of not knowing what it is that's out there getting us, it surely must have been one of the most frightening aspects of the whole thing.
How did politicians and public health officials respond to this? They tried to shut down schools, like you mentioned, which is good, but from what I understand, they did lots of things that I'm just sure exacerbated this. What was that like?
Well, as I said, the schools, some districts closed down, some didn't. In some places, cafes were closed. In many places, of course, the very fact that there weren't people in the workforce meant that things closed down. So, for example, the police department, the fire departments, such as they were back then, had problems, with their staff filling shifts, because one of the aspects of this disease that we haven't mentioned so far is that the influenza epidemic of 1918 had a predilection for otherwise healthy young men and women, young adults. So typically, influenza to this day, it affects all of us, but it's more likely to cause complications in the very young, in the elderly, and those with chronic heart or lung problems. Those populations are always more at risk. And that was true of 1918 as well. But the disease also would cause more death and more disability in otherwise healthy people for reasons that we don't fully understand today. And so because of that, you had this problem with the workforce of the time. And so, for example, in Philadelphia, the telephone exchange was basically working on emergency calls only. They didn't have enough staff to route the calls. You remember those pictures of it was usually women who were routing calls by plugging in the telephone cords to where you wanted your call to be directed. There was simply not enough people to route the calls. And so in Philadelphia, they told everybody, we're only going to route an emergency call, nothing else. And so you really see here a sense of disruption of everyday life. Now, some people actually tried to, what's the right word? They tried to sort of steam ahead, despite the fact that there were these, these problems. And I think one example that I write in the book that really goes to this is the story of Harold Edel. Now, I want you to take everybody back to October of 1918. So we're in the middle of the Great War. We are in the middle of the pandemic, and there's a new Charlie Chaplin movie called Shoulder Arms. It's a comedy about the Great War that takes place on the battlefields of France, and everybody loves it. And people now are leaving their homes, going to see this movie, Shoulder Arms. And Harold Edel is this young 29-year-old manager of the Strand Theatre in New York. And he takes out a full-page ad in a magazine called The Moving Picture World. And in this magazine, Edel says that it's true. He says some theaters were shunned by, quote, panic-stricken people. But he writes in this ad, he says, I want to congratulate all those who, quote, take their lives in their hands to see it. And at the bottom of the ad, double underlined and in a great big font, he cites the recommendation of the Board of Health to, quote, avoid crowds. And then he writes in this ad, New Yorkers took their life in their hands and packed the Strand Theatre all weeks. So here you have this movie manager who's saying, well done, everybody. It's great that you came out despite the flu pandemic. It's great that you came out to see the movie. Unfortunately, Harold Edel did not live to see this go into print. He died from influenza a week before this ad came out. And, it's a remarkable example of the attempt to keep life going, sometimes in the face of good of good hygiene and good practice. And Edel almost seems to be laughing at those who took the advice of doctors and to stay home. And he said, well, thank you all for coming. But unfortunately, he himself died of epidemic influenza before that ad went to press. So another example of perhaps how people are trying to keep life as going as normal as you can, with the realization that it's anything but normal.
It's interesting you mentioned that influenza struck the young, which with all the discussion around the coronavirus, it's been emphasized repeatedly that young children are almost never affected. It's typically those with respiratory infections or respiratory trouble and the elderly Do you know approximately what the fatality rate was of those who came down with influenza?
We know from some records because the people who kept the institutions that kept the best records were the military. And so you have records from the military of those who were sick and those who died. So we do have those records. We don't have them from civilians because rather like what I suspect is going to turn out today, most people who came down with influenza didn't make it to the hospital because they didn't need to go. Again, even though the Spanish influenza had a very high fatality rate, it was only 2% or thereabouts. And so that meant that 98% of the people who came down with this disease survived. And surely the majority of those who did survived at home because, number one, the hospitals were already full. And number two, as we've said, there was some that doctors had some treatments that were more likely to do you harm than good. We don't know the numbers of people in total in the civilian population who actually came down with influenza. But the rates were certainly very high. Again, depends. In some villages, it wiped out 80% of the population. In some places, far fewer, perhaps only 3 or 4% of the people died from it. But in any setting, it was horrible. And in the city of Philadelphia, to go back there for an example, we know that they quickly ran out of coffins. We know that there were price hikes, that the price of a coffin went up 600%, causing the city to enact a ruling that you're only allowed to increase the price of coffins by 20%. No more war profiteering. So we know that the death rate was so high.
And with hospitals, you had mentioned that what doctors do can harm as much as they help. Was there any understanding that you need to put those with Spanish influenza in different wards than somebody who'd have a common injury, or are people placed together side by side?
On the cover of my book is one of those iconic photos from the great influenza pandemic. It's of an influenza ward, and you can see there, it looks like a large gymnasium, a very large gymnasium. There are probably a few hundred, people sitting on cots just at arm's length from each other. Somebody in one bed could reach out and touch the hand of the person next to him. Some are wearing masks, some are not. There is nothing between them. And this was an influenza ward. This is where people who were coughing and sneezing and who had active influenza were sent to recover. And you look at that and you say it's a wonder that any of them survived. If I was doing particularly well, then I could easily pick up, if not influenza, then some other germ from the poor soldier lying next to me. In some settings, there are pictures like this where there is a flimsy cotton cloth between the cots. But overall, even though it was understood that masks have a place, and even though it was understood that we shouldn't spit, the last place that you really wanted to put somebody was in a ward full of other people who were coughing. And yet that's precisely what happened, which is why I said earlier that if you were lucky, you didn't go to the hospital, you stayed home, and that probably gave you a much higher chance of recovery.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. How did Spanish influenza eventually run its course?
In a number of different ways. First of all, as we said, a number of people succumbed to the illness, and those who managed to overcome the illness, and that was the overwhelming number, perhaps 98% or higher, they now had immunity to the disease. And so you couldn't catch it a second time. You could catch a different flu virus, of course, but you couldn't catch this particular version of the virus. So those who were weak died from it. Those who survived it had now survived it. And so that was the first thing. It was just, and that's true, by the way, of many forms of infection to this day. It's sort of, we had to talk about in history, cyclical cholera epidemics of the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s. And they would often just sort of fizzle out as those who succumbed to the disease died, and those who gained some kind of immunity survived. So there was that aspect, but I think an important aspect was simply that influenza doesn't like warm conditions. It doesn't like humid conditions. Same is true of coronavirus, by the way. And so we see this every year, right? We know when influenza season is every year. We get prepared for it. You can see the ads that come out for all kinds of medications and get your influenza vaccine. And then come the springtime, it goes away. And that's what happened in the spring of 1918, although it came back in the fall. And that's what happened in 1919. As the warmer weather came in, there was certainly still influenza around, but it did what influenza does every year, which is it gets less and less and less as the warm weather sets in. And that's what happened.
You started this episode comparing this to coronavirus. Based on the fuller dive into Spanish influenza, why was it that so deadly when so far with coronavirus, we'll see how many cases we get. As of this recording, there's over 100,000 confirmed cases and slightly over 3,000 fatalities. Was it simply because Spanish influenza was spread with almost no check whatsoever on it spreading? And would coronavirus have the same sort of death toll if it had spread in the same way, or are there differences between the two?
Well, I think there's some very important differences between the two. First of all, we're now living in the antibiotic era. So it turns out that we think the majority of the deaths that were caused by the great influenza pandemic of 1918 were not caused directly by the virus itself, although that was certainly responsible for many of them. But what you had was a virus that infected people, weakened the lungs, and allowed a secondary infection, a bacterial infection, to take over. And it was that secondary pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, that probably caused the majority of the deaths. Now, what we have today, we have a similar story with COVID-19, that we have some deaths that are related primarily to the virus itself. But a great many of the complications are from secondary pneumonias. And today we're living in an era where we have antibiotics. Now, of course, everybody knows that antibiotic resistance is a problem that we have to deal with. But we do have very good antibiotics today that can deal with these secondary infections. So that's the first difference. The second difference is, of course, that we now also have medications that can target the virus itself. Now, antibiotics don't target viruses, which is why you shouldn't ask your doctor for an antibiotic if you have a viral infection. However, we also have antivirals. There are a few of them, maybe a half a dozen or so, that target the virus itself. To be honest, they're not terribly good. Even the proponents of the antivirals will say that we need to have better antivirals, but we do have them out there. So we have not only medicines that can treat secondary bacterial infections, we also have medicines that can actually attack the virus itself. And the other big difference is the existence of hospitals and intensive care units that simply didn't exist. We mentioned these enormous gymnasia filled with men. They were the troops, so they were all men. These enormous gymnasia filled with men coughing on each other. Now we understand infection control much better. And there's no doubt that we are in a position to take care of the very sickest people in a way that they was simply inconceivable 100 years ago. And to remind ourselves that the vast majority of people who are going to come down with COVID-19, to the best of our understanding, are going to have nothing more than cough and cold symptoms that will then go away. It's, of course, the people with chronic illnesses, chronic problems, and especially the elderly, who must be very, very cautious and careful from COVID-19. But for the rest of the population, it doesn't appear to be a particularly dangerous disease right now.
Something that historians have looked at are the effects on a society after something as devastating as a pandemic happens. And those who've looked at the Black Plague argue that it's what started the Renaissance. It broke down the medieval order and serfdom, allowing the mercantile class to rise. So in Europe, you have a breakaway from feudal systems that didn't happen in China and Japan and other places until centuries later. And they would say that is a nice result of the plague. Now, I don't want to talk about the sunny side of Spanish influenza, but this affected society. So what were some changes that you saw after 1918?
You're absolutely right. Nothing stands in isolation. And in 1918, for example, we spoke about the fact that it had a predilection for the young, otherwise healthy worker. So many more of these people died in the plague than you would have imagined. Now, the results of that were that well, that their jobs opened up, right? So it turns out that because so many working age men and